Iran now has major influence in neighboring states. In Iraq, probably if you ask me, what's the most powerful state in Iraq today, I would say Iran. What's the most powerful state in Syria today is Iran. What's the most powerful state in Lebanon is Iran. In Yemen as well. This tells you how these armed groups have really and given Iran power multiplier in the region. Not only in terms of expanding its influence, also these armed groups provide the Iranian Republic with another layer of security.
Hello and welcome to Frontline for Times Radio with me, Kate Chabot. And today we are talking to Fawaz Gerges, Professor of International Relations at the London School of Economics and Political Science. He holds the Emirates Professorship in Contemporary Middle East Studies and has taught at Oxford, Harvard and Columbia Universities. Fawaz is a well-known commentator and writer on the Middle East, and his latest book is What Really Went Wrong, The West and the Failure of Democracy in the Middle East. Fawaz, great to have you on Frontline. Thank you so much for your time.
My pleasure. Thanks for having me.
As we speak, Fawaz, the US has yet to retaliate for the killing of 3 US soldiers in a small military outpost close to the Syrian border in Jordan. Can you tell us more about Kataib Hezbollah, the militant group being held responsible?
Well, Kataib Hezbollah, or the brigades of Hezbollah, is an armed Iraqi group supported militarily and financially by Iran. It's a very pro-Iranian group. And I think what your audience need to know is that Kataib Hezbollah has been engaged in skirmishes and in fighting with the United States for the past few years. It was the Trump administration that ordered the killing of its top leader with the Iranian general Soleimani in Iraq. And the United States has been retaliating and against some of Kataib Hezbollah attacks in Iraq. So this is not just a one-time off. You have a very prolonged confrontation between Kataib Hezbollah, the brigades of Hezbollah, and the United States. And if you tell me what's the overarching goal of Kataib Hezbollah, would be the expulsion of American forces from Iraq. Its goal is to really increase the costs of the American footprint in Iraq, and this is the same goal of Iran as well.
Yeah, I'll ask you a little bit more about the killing, that assassination, a little later on. But just wanted to ask you a little bit more about Kataib Hezbollah. It's been around since 2023, as I understand it, so relatively new. Why did it actually form?
Well, I mean, you have Hezbollah, Kataib Hezbollah is not the only armed group in Iraq. You have almost a dozen armed groups. And they mostly are supported by Iran. They are trained by Iran. But they also, of course, they have their own, internal goals as well, which is really the promotion of Shiite interests in the country itself. I think what we need to take into account is that the American invasion and occupation of Iraq in 2003, almost 20 years now, I mean, the anniversary was in March 2003, really, and also the American invasion and occupation of Afghanistan, turned Iraq into a regional superpower. Since 2005, 2006, Iran has created a network of allies, militias, and armed groups, not just in Iraq, in Lebanon, in Syria, and now in Yemen, that basically they are power multipliers for Iran, and they also allow Iran to expand its interest in the neighboring countries. So its very existence is designed not only to promote Iranian influence and power in Iraq, but also to force the Americans out of Iraq, because they believe that the United States is basically has done a great deal of damage to Iraq over the past 20 years or so.
What is Iran's end goal?
Well, if you think of Iran has a vision of itself as a regional pivotal power, as a regional superpower. Iran is a state, is a state, is a state. I mean, that's what we define it in international relations. is a state that basically, whenever it sees vacuum, it feels this particular vacuum. Whether you're talking about the United States or whether you're talking, Iran has an idea, a worldview that it has the natural right to be a major player in the region. And that's why when the United States invaded Afghanistan and Iraq and the U.S. global war on terror, vast security vacuums were established in the region. And what Iran has really been trying to do, I would have done the same thing as a state. What Iran has been trying to do is to fill the vacuum created by the chaos and the wars, as a result of the American invasion and occupations of Afghanistan and Iraq, and then the turmoil in the region. It's maximized states' interest. I mean, I think people say, "Oh, Iran is a Shia-dominated state." Well, whether it's a Shia-dominated state or whether it's a Sunni-dominated state, Iran is a state. Is a state that promotes and expands its influence near and wide, and that's really what Iran has been doing in the past 20 years or so.
You mentioned that the many allied militias or proxies that Iran has in the country, such as Lebanon, Syria, Yemen, and Gaza, part of this axis of resistance. How many groups are we talking about? And do they have one thing in common, or do they just align on certain geopolitical aims, or perhaps domestic aims?
Kataib Hezbollah released a statement in the past 24 hours. And the statement says that, in fact, Iran has been trying to persuade Kataib Hezbollah not to escalate the confrontation with the United States in Iraq. The report released by the Kataib Hezbollah, what they're trying to say is that while they are pro-Iranians, while they are armed and supported by Iran, they have their own interests, their own worldview, their own goals. And I think what I'm trying to say is that if we look at Hezbollah in Lebanon and Kataib Hezbollah in Iraq and the Houthis in Yemen, and we think somehow they take direct order from Iran, this is misleading. This is false. In fact, the leader of Hezbollah in Lebanon, which really helps to train and guide Kataib Hezbollah in Iraq, has made it very clear. He has repeatedly said, there is no centralized decision making. The so-called axis of resistance in Lebanon, in Syria, in Iraq, in Yemen, they don't take direct orders from Iran. They coordinate, they consult, but at the end of the day, they also have their own interest inside their countries. And in the report, in the release by the Kataib Hezbollah, in the past, 24 hours or so, it says, in fact, our brothers in Iran really do not really want to attack the Americans inside Iraq itself, but we basically have our own interest. And I'm paraphrasing and what the report says.
And do you believe that statement?
Look, I have no doubts in my mind, and I could be wrong, that even if Iran, the Iranian leadership, tells the Houthis in Yemen or Hezbollah in Lebanon, don't show solidarity with the Palestinians, they would not listen to Iran. That is what we need to understand, and this is really the misleading narrative in the West, very superficial, I'm sorry to say, is that somehow we think that Iran calls the shots, that Iran orders Hezbollah in Lebanon or the Houthis in Yemen or Kataib Hezbollah to do its own bidding. That's not how it works. Iran has tremendous influence. Iran exercises considerable influence over its network of allies, armed groups. But at the end of the day, certain questions like Palestine and the war in Gaza resonate deeply, in Yemen, in Lebanon, in Iraq, in Syria, in Jordan, in Egypt. But what the big question is, you have weak, fragile states. So, think of what we're talking about, Kataib Hezbollah. You have been asking me for the past 5 minutes about Kataib Hezbollah in Iraq. You have not asked me a question, where's the Iraqi government? This is sadly, it's not a sovereign government. A government does not really have a monopoly on the use of force. As Max Weber, the German sociologist, would say, does not have any sovereignty. In fact, the Americans and the various armed groups in Iraq, they're fighting a war. Iraq, is a battlefield where the Iraqi state really is a passive actor. In fact, it was the Iraqi prime minister, al-Sudani. He met after, the attacks against the Americans in Jordan, and he told Kataib Hezbollah and the other groups he would resign. He said he would resign unless they cease their attacks. He said, "You're making a fool of me, a fool of Iraq." So I think it's a combination of pressure by a Sudani, who's also part of the axis of resistance, politically, and Iran, that has brought about this recalibration about that Kataib Hezbollah will no longer really target Americans in Iraq in the near future.
And so far, as we're actually speaking, it is working because they have suspended any attacks and said they have done so. Just to go back to Iran's influence, though, I suppose one of the most useful things, though, for Iran is this plausible deniability that it can have. It can claim to disassociate itself from the actions of these militias, even though it may sometimes serve its aims. Can Iran ever be held to account, or should it be?
Well, first of all, Iran has made it very clear that they had no connection with the attack on the Americans in Jordan that killed 3 Americans and injured about 40 American soldiers. They said, "We did not give the orders." Kataib Hezbollah said so as well, that I don't think Kataib Hezbollah took direct orders from Iran to attack the Americans. In fact, Iran has repeatedly, the supreme leader of Iran, Ali Khamenei, has repeatedly said he does not really want war with the Americans. The Americans, the intelligence assessment of the United States, the combined intelligence assessment, also has reached a conclusion that Iran does not really want war with the United States, that Iran is not really telling its allies, go and bomb the Americans.
Yes.
What Iran is trying to do, again, is to increase the costs for America's preponderant blind support for Israel in Gaza. It wants a ceasefire in Gaza. They all want a ceasefire in Gaza. So they're trying to really open different fronts in order to really make life very difficult for the Americans. So at the end of the day, you ask me whether Iran can be held accountable. I mean, Iran provides the arms. Iran provides the training. Iran provides the money. But at the end of the day, here is the predicament in international relations. The US President Joe Biden now has to walk a fine line between retaliation and without escalation. A direct attack on Iran, as the Iranian leadership has made it very clear, would probably trigger retaliation by Iran against American bases, as it happened after President Trump assassinated General Soleimani, the second most important, powerful man in Iran.
Yeah, that happened just over 4 years ago. The commander of the Islamic Revolutionary Guard Corps, he was described as the mastermind behind Iran's proxy armies. How did he build those? I mean, do you accept that? And how did he build those armies, and what effect did his death have?
Very much. I mean, Soleimani literally, in Iran, he was seen as the second most important man after Ali Khamenei. Ali Khamenei is the supreme leader, is the commander in chief. And Soleimani really played a significant role, not only in guiding and training and funding. He himself took part in the fighting in Syria against ISIS, the Islamic State. I mean, he himself was, photographed on the battlefield. In fact, some of his lieutenants were terrified that he basically was too close to, the fire. In Syria, he really, Soleimani played a key role in saving the neck of the Syrian president, Assad. Soleimani played a major role in turning Hezbollah in Lebanon into a regional power. I mean, Hezbollah now is really not just a Lebanese militia. Hezbollah is a regional power, and also played a major role in creating and guiding and mentoring and arming and training the various armed groups in Iraq. His death left a huge vacuum, huge vacuum. But the reality is, when you have networks, when you have groups, armed groups, when you have so the show goes on. Unfortunately, the death of one man or two men or would not change the calculation, the complexity of the landscape that exists in the region. Iran now has major influence in neighboring states. In Iraq, probably if you ask me, what's the most powerful state in Iraq today, I would say Iran. What's the most powerful state in Syria today is Iran. What's the most powerful state in Lebanon is Iran. In Yemen as well. This tells you how these armed groups have really and given Iran power multiplier in the region. Not only in terms of expanding its influence, also these armed groups provide the Iranian Republic with another layer of security. Any attack on Iran by the United States could trigger attacks by its allies, Hezbollah in Lebanon and in the region. So this really creates quite a dilemma for the Americans that if they decide, or the Israelis if they decide to take Iran head on.
It was suggested to me by an analyst I was speaking to this week that the Houthi attacks in the Red Sea are a sign of the Houthis' growing desire to assert themselves on the world stage. Do you think we are going to see more non-state actors and increasingly better armed non-state actors posing a direct threat to the US and its allies?
Well, I mean, let's take a bigger picture here. I mean, since really 2001. I mean, think what Al Qaeda had done in the past 20 years or so. It really it not only changed American politics, it transformed world politics. Just to give you an idea, here you have Al Qaeda never numbered more than 1,500 fighters. 1,500 fighters. The attack on the United States on 9/11. Think of what it did. The so-called America's war on terror. We estimate that the United States spent about, not me, I mean, economists at Brown's University, Watson Institute at Brown's University, and the study just came out a few months ago called The Costs of War. 100 specialists and scholars and economists calculated the cost of the U.S. global war on terror after Al-Qaeda's attack. The United States has spent $8 trillion in direct and indirect costs. 8 trillions, not billions. That is every billion, for your listeners, every trillion has 1,000 billion. We estimate that 4 million people have died. 4 million have died as a result of the U.S. war on terror in Afghanistan, in Iraq, in Yemen, in Pakistan, directly and indirectly. 20 million refugees. So think of Al-Qaeda as a non-state actor, what this tiny Al-Qaeda has been able to do to the international system, the most powerful state in the world, not to mention ISIS. So yeah, I think what we're seeing in international relations, even though the state remains the major organization in the international system, really asymmetrical warfare and non-state actors are changing the structure of international relations. I mean, think of Hezbollah. Hezbollah can take on Israel and fight a war for a couple of years and inflict major damage on Israel. And Israel knows this, as the Houthis as well. I mean, think of the damage they have done since November to world trade and the world economy. They could really bring about a recession. 30-40% of commercial shipping basically has been affected. Think of what ISIS has done. I mean, it's hundreds of thousands of casualties. So I think when we think of international relations, this is not about politics. I think we need to take into account not only the nature of asymmetrical warfare, but the state itself is no longer really the only sole unit in international relations. Non-state actors, in particular, in states that really face security dilemmas, don't really have a monopoly on use of force, really play a major role in regional politics and international relations.
And in that light, you mentioned earlier that the US finds itself in a difficult position, knowing how to respond to the killing of these 3 soldiers. What do you think is the correct way or the best way for the US to respond, the most effective way to send a message without provoking things further?
Well, look, all choices, all scenarios have costs and consequences. So if President Biden decides to attack Kataib Hezbollah and the Iraqi militias, the Republicans are going to scream coward. They have already said you're a coward. And you have presidential elections here in the United States. So President Biden has to take into account the domestic calculation. Uh, if President Biden decides to go after Iran itself, he has to take into account that his actions could really bring about the opposite, the reverse result of what he intends, that escalation. He has made it very clear that he does not seek a wider war in the region. In fact, America's strategy since the 7th of October is to prevent the escalation, the expansion of the war in Gaza. I mean, if you ask me what needs to be done, to me as an academic and as a person, I really know exactly what needs to be done. If you want the escalation, everyone, even our Secretary of State, David Cameron, our Foreign Secretary, says we need de-escalation. Okay, what's the most important action? What's the most important decision that all of us could do to bring about de-escalation? Not another attack on the Houthis, not 10 attacks against Kataib Hezbollah. It's simply trying to get a ceasefire, a peace ceasefire, a permanent ceasefire in Gaza, trying to end the catastrophic humanitarian situation that's unfolding in Gaza. Hardly any one of us talks about this anymore. The most important action that freezes all the conflicts in the region is basically bring about an end to the war in Gaza. Hezbollah in Lebanon, the Houthis in Yemen, all the armed groups in Iraq say, once the guns fall silent in Gaza, we stop our basically attacks against American bases and commercial shippings. To me, we have to take this into account. When we talk about choices, we should not all think like groupthink. Oh, what military action can we take to establish deterrence or to reestablish deterrence? Deterrence has failed. The United States strategy of deterrence has failed. The Houthis continue to attack. In fact, in the past 24 hours, dozens of attacks have taken place in Yemen and the Red Sea. American ships and American bases continue to be attacked. There is an open front between Hezbollah in Lebanon and Israel that could really escalate into another major front. So what can be done? I think this is why Britain rolls. I mean, I'm really happy that David Cameron is back I am, because he's an adult. He's not polemical. He's not rhetorical. He's not an ideologue, a demagogue like some people I'm not going to mention. He knows what needs to be done. And what needs to be done is not only focus on, I don't like the term sustainable ceasefire because it does not really go far enough for me. I want a permanent ceasefire, not because of the politics, because I'm concerned about, as you know, now the number of Palestinians killed so far now is 27,000 Palestinians today, and 66,000 injured. Not to mention you have 1.9, actually 2 million Palestinians who are displaced. Mass displacement of Palestinians. If you ask me, and I really say it based on what I know, even 50 American attacks, even 100 American attacks against the Houthis and Kataib Hezbollah and Hezbollah in Lebanon will not bring about de-escalation. In fact, it will bring about escalation rather than de-escalation. So the choice facing the U.S. president is not easy at all. And I'm glad I'm not part of his team, because his team is agonizing over how to respond, how to reestablish the deterrence that has failed.
And who knows, Fawaz, the situation between Gaza and Israel may not be resolved when we have a new US president, and that could be Donald Trump. He's claimed none of this would ever have happened had he been president now. Under his presidency, he said Iran was broken under his control. Even before the assassination of Qasem Soleimani, there was a very dangerous escalatory moment under his watch, though, in 2019, when this US drone was shot down the Strait of Hormuz, and he ordered, then called off at last minute, as we understand it, a strike against Iran, followed by an attack on Saudi Arabia, on an oil facilities there, attributed to the Yemeni Houthis. It does go to show, though, how easily things can escalate.
Very, very much. Look, I'm very critical of President Biden's policy, especially his blind support for Benjamin Netanyahu, because we know who's Benjamin Netanyahu. Benjamin Netanyahu is all about Benjamin Netanyahu. Benjamin Netanyahu has spent his political career trying to veto and undermine and destroy the notion of Palestinian state. But the truth is many of the things that are happening now are basically took place on Trump's hands. I mean, let me give you one idea what we mean by that. He basically changed the calculus in Israel itself, Israel-Palestine. President Trump occupied East Jerusalem on a silver platter to Benjamin Netanyahu. President Trump legalized illegal Jewish settlements in Palestinian lands. President Trump violated the nuclear treaty that was signed by President Obama in 2015. In fact, I'm going to make a statement, and I hope I'm wrong. President Trump will historically be remembered as the president who allowed Iran to become a nuclear power. Iran now is closer than ever to developing the capacity to turn its nuclear program into weaponize its nuclear program. And this is as a direct result of a president who violated a treaty that has frozen Iran's nuclear capacity. So President Trump cannot come and play this game. And the reason why Netanyahu and his extreme coalition doing what they're doing, because it was Trump who empowered them. It was Trump who told them you could do anything.
Mm. And Fawaz, on the stalled nuclear deal, Iran nuclear deal, the Biden administration had sought to restore that agreement. Talks have stalled on both sides. They've stopped, but they're stopping short of saying that they've actually failed. You said you hope you're wrong, but you think that Iran will become a nuclear power. Do you think, is that now looking very likely? And how soon do you think that could be?
I think Iran is a nuclear power in progress. All Iran has to do is to make a decision to weaponize its nuclear program. It's a matter of weeks. And the big point I'm trying to make is that President Trump played a decisive role in allowing Iran to say, look, you violated the treaty, and I'm going to enrich uranium to a higher degree. And Iran has been doing so. And look, from an analytical point of view, I see always you put yourself in in Iranians' shoe. If I were an Iranian leader, that's exactly what I would do. And Iran is a state. What we need to tell, it doesn't matter whether you like the Iranian, they're not my cup of tea, of course. But Iran is a state that is, people think that, look at the clerics, they have been expanding their power. People don't realize that Iran was more aggressive, more interventionist under the Shah. It was the Shah of Iran who started the nuclear program. It was the Shah of Iran who basically captured three United Arab Emirates island. The Shah of Iran anointed himself with the American help as the Sheriff of the Gulf. So when we think of Iran, I want your audience to think of Iran not in terms of the clerics. I want your audience to think of Iran as a state that has a vision, a worldview of itself as a great power. And Iran, that's how the clerics, like the Shah of Iran, and whoever regime comes after the clerics, will continue to behave in this particular sense, in the sense of being really have a worldview of Iran as naturally positioned to play a great power role.
You, in your latest book, you argue that the instability in the contemporary Middle East has been brought about partly by post-war US leaders getting it wrong, that they should have allowed more autonomy to develop countries to develop their own political and economic status. Given what we can see at the moment happening in the Middle East, what do you think is at stake exactly, and how do you think that what you describe as mistakes of the past can be recalibrated to preserve a more stable future?
I mean, look, we're talking about Iran, right? We've been talking about Iran for half an hour. I want you to think of Iran in 1953. My book, the most important case in my book is Iran, 1953. What happened in 1953? The Prime Minister of Iran in 1953, his name was Mohammad Mossadegh. Mohammad Mossadegh was a liberal Democrat, a person who believed in the rule of law, who believes in checks and balances, who was democratically elected, who believes in women's rights, who basically opened Iran to the world. He was a liberal. And guess what happened to Muhammad Mossadegh in August 1953? He was toppled by a joint operation by the CIA and M16. August 1953. Why? Because he dared to nationalize Iran's oil in order to really use the oil to modernize and industrialize Iran. That particular decision, you toppled one of the most, Muhammad Mossadegh was compared to Gandhi in terms of a peace forward-looking man. And guess what we did after that? Installed the Shah of Iran, and who established an authoritarian, a brutal apparatus in Iran that ultimately led to what you and I talk about, the rise, the emergence of the clerics. This tells you in a nutshell how American foreign policy, and sadly the UK, wherever the United States goes, the UK follows, whether it was 1950s or 1960s or the invasion, occupation of Iraq, or now. It seems to me there's an umbilical cord between American foreign policy and British foreign policy. But my book, what I'm trying to do in my book is to show that at the end of World War II, the United States, and to a large extent the United Kingdom, instead of supporting post-colonial leaders who really had great visions for their countries, who wanted to establish organic states, who wanted to modernize, industrialize, and become independent, in fact, it penalized independent, assertive nationalist leaders like Mossadegh, who basically dared to think the unthinkable.
And just to put the current situation into context, Fawaz, finally, the US Secretary of State, Antony Blinken, says the Middle East faces its most dangerous conditions in 50 years. It's described the situation as incredibly volatile. How do you see it?
I mean, if you ask me, I've been teaching the modern Middle East for decades. The Middle East today is more volatile and more unstable than any moment in its modern history. Truly, it's a tinderbox. It takes a spark to ignite a wider regional conflict. What we need is real de-escalation. And I hope, and I pray that Secretary Cameron, would really translate his, rhetoric in the past a few weeks into reality by taking independent action based on British interest, and does not really follow exactly what the Americans, always want the United Kingdom to do. My hope is for real de-escalation, ending the war in Gaza, having an international conference, recognizing a Palestinian state, welcoming a Palestinian state to the United Nations, two states living side by side in peace, an Israeli state and a Palestinian state on the West Bank and Gaza, which occupied East Jerusalem as its capital. Living side by side in peace, genuine reconciliation between the Jewish community in Israel and the Palestinian Arab community in Palestine.
Fawaz Gerges, it's been great speaking to you. Thank you so much for your time.
Thank you for having me.
You've been watching Frontline for Times Radio. My thanks to Louis Sykes, our producer. To support the work of Frontline, hit the subscribe button. You can also listen to Times Radio throughout the day or read it at times.co.uk. Thanks for watching. Bye-bye.